Question over here.
I didn't understand who would not.
Well, we expect the debt reduction proposal crafted by Majority Leader Harry Reid to be considered on the Senate floor this afternoon. That's expected to consume the majority of debate today in the Senate as senators return from their weekly party meetings. And now we go to live coverage of the U.S. Senate.
Mr. Alexander.
While the Senate remains in this quorum call, we're going to go live now to the Capitol, where Senator Harry Reid, Majority Leader Reid, is updating reporters following their weekly party lunches.
We are united. The Senate plan is the only real compromise we have in Congress today, and it's the best shot we have to avoiding an economic crisis a week from today. The rating agency S&P said that our plan would avoid a downgrading of our credit rating, and conversely, Speaker Boehner's plan would cause a downgrading. Even Grover Norquist gave his blessing to our plan today, opening the door, I hope, for Republicans to vote with us. That's why in our meeting today, in the room right behind me, we decided that members of our caucus would start reaching out to our Republican colleagues to encourage them to support our plan. The Senate plan is a reasonable middle ground. Democrats support it because it protects the middle class. It prevents damaging cuts to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Republicans should support it because it contains the two things they've asked for all along. It does not contain revenues, and the amount of cut meets the amount of the debt ceiling increase. Speaker Boehner's plan is not a compromise. It was written for the Tea Party, not the American people. Democrats will not vote for it. Democrats will not vote for it. Democrats will not vote for it. It's dead on arrival in the Senate, if they get it out of the House. The Tea Party is in the driver's seat for the House Republicans now, and that's a very, very scary thought. That's why I hope my Republican colleagues will think long and hard about what direction they want to move. They can either support the Tea Party and their plan, which has no chance of passing, or they can work with us to forge a responsible approach. So I say to my friends, as we say on the other side of the aisle, let's get this done. Let's do what we need to do to work this out. This is so very, very important to the American people. If this debt limit is not increased, every American will have a tax increase. Every American, rich and poor, middle class, otherwise. So we need to work together. That's what the American people want, and that's what I've expressed time and time again. I was a lawyer, practiced law. I compromised then to get cases settled, to avoid trial, get to trial. My many years as a legislator, I have learned a long time ago that legislation is the art of compromise. And it's too bad people on the other side of this Capitol don't know those words.
Speaker Boehner is as committed as McConnell to avoiding a default.
I believe that the Speaker would like to avoid a default, but he sure has a funny way of showing it. He has been uncompromising, and he is, based on the right-wing direction that Cox has taken, unless he decides to step back and be a statesman and not be driven by these right-wing ideologues, that's where we're headed. Pardon me? Well, I haven't decided yet. We have an opportunity to do that, and I'm giving that some consideration. I hope that we're in a quorum call here. I hope to have another visit with the Republican leader soon, see what ideas he has.
Senator, Republican compromise talks are going on behind the scenes. Senator Kyle said all of you are actually still talking, despite what it may appear to some of us before the cameras, that you are actually talking behind the scenes.
For those of you who couldn't hear, are there talks going on? You know, we just had a vote here on a judge, and a Republican senator who I respect them all, but this one I really respect a lot. Very nice man, knowledgeable, knows what's going on around here. Came to him and he said, I appreciate what you're doing. You're trying to work something out. I appreciate that. Now, he didn't say he's going to vote for my bill, but I think when we have conversations like that, it gives me hope. Even though Leader McConnell and I are very, we don't seem to agree a lot on the floor. We get along well. We're good friends. We spent a lot of time together over the weekend. And I told my caucus.
Leaving Majority Leader Harry Reid to go back now to the Senate
Senators
floor.
permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Is there objection? Without objection. Order. The junior senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, this past Sunday, an editorial by the New York Times titled, "In the Wake of Fukushima," noted that if nuclear power is to have a future in this country, Americans should have confidence that regulators and the industry are learning the lessons of Fukushima and are taking all steps necessary to ensure safety. Following the events at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant in March, it's clear that maintaining America's confidence in the safety of our nuclear reactors is paramount. The disaster at Fukushima should not lead to a freeze of the nuclear industry. Instead, it should be an opportunity to upgrade the safety of our nuclear fleet. Both industry and the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission assure us that currently there is no immediate threat to the operation of our nuclear plants. Nuclear power is especially important to my home state of Illinois, where nearly half of all electricity in the state is nuclear. With 11 of 104 nuclear power plants and stations in our state, we have more reactors than any other state in the Union. In the near term, it's my hope that nuclear regulatories and the industry will take actions necessary to increase safety measures and integrate emergency operating procedures. Furthermore, nuclear plants should swiftly implement sensible measures to increase flood protections, enhance containment venting capabilities, install remote monitoring controls of spent fuel pool conditions, and upgrade the ability to cope and maintain operations by a single station sustained for initially 8 hours and eventually up to 72 hours, utilizing pre-planned and pre-staged resources. Now, moving forward, one of our top priorities should be enhancing flood protection at reactors. Obviously, reactors for their cooling need to be near large bodies of water, subject to flood. Fukushima highlighted the need to take additional protections to guarantee that current backup pumps and generators are also protected against flood or other seismic events. The recent flooding on the Missouri River is a demonstration of the need for such enhancements. Although flood barriers and procedures have so far protected the Fort Calhoun nuclear plant in Nebraska, this is not the time to look away from making further efforts on protecting reactors from floods. One of the ringing lessons of the Fukushima disaster is the need for enhanced capabilities for nuclear operators to cope with prolonged power outages. Every U.S. nuclear plant should be able to cope with a prolonged loss of power for at least 8 hours for an initial period, and eventually 72 hours using only the resources on site, so that plant operators can utilize pre-planned and pre-staged equipment and muster other resources if necessary. We should be prepared for simultaneous events at multiple reactors on site and should be able to maintain key power functions in the face of varying circumstances, including debilitated infrastructure, a lack of communication, and especially the loss of on-site power. It's clear that operators' capability to cope with the prolonged loss of power was critical at Fukushima. We know that the tsunami hit the Fukushima Daiichi plant and wiped out all alternating power and backup power necessary to provide resources to the cooling pumps. This eventually caused overheating in both reactor vessels and cooling ponds. The ability to perform these critical functions and to monitor them, providing power to fans and pumps, and to remotely open and close vents and valves, the inability of the Japanese to perform these functions caused them to lose control of key areas or to maintain cooling to critical spent fuel ponds and reactor vessels. The Japanese also were unable to remotely monitor conditions, especially in their spent fuel pools, and struggled continuously to pump enough water into the reactors. Operators need to have proper instrumentation at far remote locations so that they can continue to understand what is happening in reactors and cooling ponds if an event occurs. Furthermore, we need to install proper venting upgrades on all reactors with the Mark II containment design. This is an important step in preventing any kind of overpressurization or in reducing risk of operations that we saw so clearly at Fukushima. Now, in the United States, there are 23 reactors with the Mark I containment design. We have known since 1989 that there are flaws with the pressure containment system of the original Mark I designed boiling water reactor. As a precaution, industry upgraded the Mark I containments with hardened vents to protect against excessive pressure in the containment. According to the NRC's very recent Task Force 90-day report, which examined the safety of nuclear power plants, the hardened vents are not universally installed on the Mark II containments inside the United States. The task force noted further that because the Mark II containments are only 25% larger than the volume of the Mark I, it's conceivable that the Mark II containments under a similar situation would suffer the same consequences as Units 1 through 4 at Fukushima. We should install hardened vents on all Mark II containment reactors and not allow any more time to pass before making deliberate improvements to address these safety concerns. Now, as we press forward with nuclear power generation, I believe that the NRC should also update our emergency planning zones. This is the evacuation zone that's pre-planned around every nuclear power plant. It seems prudent now, in the light of the experience at Fukushima, that we should expand the emergency planning zone to the Japanese radius of 20 kilometers or 12.5 miles around each nuclear reactor. These EPZs should also be updated with the latest 2010 census data of the number of Americans residing around these reactors. And the NRC should require enough radiation dose medication to handle at least 2 full EPC evacuations, if necessary. We also know that the spent fuel pools posed a serious threat to the safety of the site. Throughout the crises, Fukushima crews struggled to maintain water levels at these spent fuel pools to prevent an escape of uncontained radiation in the environment. For those of us that know a little bit about reactors, this was a surprise, because normally we are totally focused on what is happening inside the reactor. But at Fukushima, as much attention had to be paid on overheating in the spent fuel ponds. This warning should serve as a beginning of an effort for us to relook at the issue of spent fuel in the United States, especially spent fuel which is stored near our drinking water sources. We all know that 96% of all the fresh water in the United States is in the Great Lakes, and I am concerned that we store approximately 1,000 tons of highly radioactive spent nuclear fuel just 200 yards from the Lake Michigan shoreline at the now-defunct Zion nuclear reactor. Any proposal to stop the permanent disposal of nuclear waste in Nevada is a proposal to continue storing highly radioactive nuclear fuel right next to America's source of 96% of its fresh water. I believe that we should now continue to reinvigorate the process of building the Yucca Mountain facility. Any proposal to not build Yucca is a proposal to pose a clear and present long-term danger to the environmental future of the Great Lakes. The bottom line is that we should not let the lessons learned from the Fukushima disaster become a forgotten story. That the NRC task force and its 90-day report issued after the Fukushima disaster is a serious document that now should lead not just to further studies and consultant reports, but comprehensive action, like hardened vents, like making sure that we have remote monitoring of spent fuel ponds, that all reactors be able to operate first 8 and then 72 hours without outside power, and that we take the other measures to upgrade our safety, like expanding the EPZs. Tomorrow I will be testifying before the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and as the junior senator for the state of Illinois, the most nuclear state in America, I'll carry a strong message that nuclear power has a strong future in the United States, but one that should be going forward in light of the lessons of Fukushima. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Utah.
Well, Mr. President, last night we heard from President Obama in a primetime address from the East Room of the White House. The topic was raising the federal debt limit. According to the Treasury Secretary Geithner, the federal government may breach the statutory debt limit as early as August 2nd, 2011. That's 1 week from today. Remarkably, the President, in yet another primetime address, again hectored the American people about the need for politically charged tax hikes as a cure-all for our debt and deficit and debt problems. You have to hand it to the President. He is a true believer. For the President, there seems to be no problem in Washington that can't be fixed with tax increases. Even his own party has moved beyond him on this. To be certain, Democrats have not become the party of tax relief. For example, the plan offered by the Majority Leader does not address the 10-year tax increase of $3.5 trillion that is set to kick in on January 1st, 2013. But last night on CNN, one reporter got it about right. This is how she put it. Quote, nobody's talking about tax increases except Barack Obama, unquote. For weeks, the President and his surrogates on and off Capitol Hill have been talking about tax increases as the solution to our debt crisis. But the President was on his own last night. It was a speech very much divorced from the reality of our situation. Republicans are insistent that the solution to a spending crisis is not giving government more money to spend. And here's the dirty secret. Many members of the President's own party are not keen on tax increases either. They know that the President's politically driven tax increases in the context of trillions in deficits and debt will do little to restore the nation's fiscal footing. And they know that more significant tax increases will hit the middle class and small business job creators very hard. But even as his troops have left him, President Obama soldiers on, leading the fight for higher taxes and spreading the wealth around. The President talked last night about the need for a balanced approach. Here's what he means by that. To balance the budget his way, we will have to raise taxes by roughly $2 trillion. So what does he think of the plan of the Senate's distinguished majority leader? After all, the majority leader has put forward a plan that does not contain tax increases, or at least that's the claim. Presumably, the President would therefore oppose the majority leader's plan as unbalanced. But that would assume the President's not playing politics with this debate. That would assume that he's more concerned with solving our nation's debt crisis than appealing to his base, getting his approval ratings up, and positioning himself for re-election. Somehow, in spite of his absolute insistence on the need for tax increases and a balanced solution to the debt limit debate, the President supports the majority leader's proposal. The President likes to present himself as the only reasonable man in Washington, but as he proved again with his latest politically driven inconsistency, he is as partisan as they come. And to the disappointment of his campaign advisors, it is clear that the American people are demanding a leader who will be straight with them rather than focus on election year positioning. If the President and his party came clean with the American people, this is what they would acknowledge. Non-defense discretionary spending is at historic highs. The nation's biggest spending programs are completely out of control and set for bankruptcy. Over the next 10 years, the President's budget would drive this country into debt by an additional $13 trillion. Most importantly, they would acknowledge that the nation's problem is principally too much spending, not too little taxes. I don't envy my friends on the other side of the aisle. They are in a tough place. On the one hand, their liberal base refuses any structural reforms to the spending programs that are driving the country's debt to the brink. On the other hand, absent these structural reforms, the middle class and job creators will have to be hit with historic tax increases. Obviously, they cannot be open about this second point, or they risk the ire of American voters. Those who represent San Francisco and the Upper West Side might be able to go home and sell these tax increases, but for Democrats responsible to entire states, not just to small liberal enclaves, such tax increases are a much tougher pitch. So what is a Democrat to do? You can't propose meaningful spending reductions, but you can't support job-killing tax increases. So this is what they will do. This is what they're going to do. They choose to ignore the real problem. They offer up no plan. They refuse to present a budget for more. They've actually refused to present a budget for more than 800 days. They dodge and weave. One minute the President's for real reforms to Medicare. The next minute he's accusing Republicans of trying to destroy Medicare for recommending reforms. And they hope that their friends in the media ignore the failure to offer up a real solution. As you can see from this chart, the problem is spending, and we need a solution commensurate with that problem. As you can see, spending is the red line. Taxes happen to be the blue line. Spending as a percentage of GDP is much higher than the historical average. The average level of spending has been around 18% since World War II. Since President Obama took office in 2008, spending has surged to over actually 25% at one point of our economy, way above the 18 to 20% norm. Tax receipts have dipped, but they are expected to come back. CBO estimates, however, that spending is currently set to stay at around 24%. As you can see, spending is the red line, and it goes off the charts here during 2009, 2010, and on into 2020. Taxes have always been right where they are. They went up pretty high, came down, now they're back up. And as you can see from the chart, President Obama's 2012 budget does not help one bit in reducing this level of spending. The President's budget is not balanced by any means. Again, the problem for the President is this. Even while he was explaining to Joe the plumber the moral and civic imperative of spreading the wealth around, he was promising not to raise taxes on individuals making less than $200,000 or families making less than $250,000. But if he is going to balance the budget by attempting to pay for current levels of discretionary spending that Lyndon Johnson only dreamed of, and spending programs that are permanently in the red, he is going to have to hit the middle class hard. He is going to have to break his promise. Not exactly a political winner. Even as he talked about moving the Democratic Party to the left and abandoning the comparative moderation of the Clinton administration, he remembers well the fate of Walter Mondale. When accepting his party's nomination for president in San Francisco in 1984, Walter Mondale promised Americans that he was going to raise their taxes. President Reagan went on to win in a 49-state landslide. President Obama does not want to suffer the same fate as Walter Mondale, so he avoids discussion of the tax increases on the middle class that he really believes in. Instead, in this debate, he has focused on a number of politically opportunistic red herrings that will have minimal impact on the nation's debt crisis. The purpose of these red herrings is to distract Americans from the real driver of our deficits and debt and the real choices that Democrats have to, but are refusing to make. Let's just look at a few of these examples. The President has been talking incessantly about the need to tax corporate jets. Well, if we were to raise the depreciable life on corporate jets from 5 years to 7 years, as the Democrats proposed, it would yield at least according to the economists, it would yield $3.1 billion, that's with a B, over 10 years. Just to be clear, as we are discussing these paltry numbers which the President would have you believe are key to restoring the market's confidence in the American economy and our ability to manage our debt, the United States will run a budget deficit this year of $1.5 trillion. Our national debt is $14.3 trillion. The President's budget assumes an additional $13 trillion in debt on top of that. And the President is talking about the tax treatment of corporate jets, which, if he got his way, would raise $3.1 billion over 10 years. This is about as effective as one of my fellow Utahns standing in his driveway in Little Cottonwood Canyon during a blizzard, flicking a snowflake off his shoulder and claiming that he was finished shoveling for the day. To hear the President talk, you would think that this proposal is absolutely critical to balancing our budget. Well, to put it in perspective, over the next 10 years of debt that this nation is set to take on, it would equate to roughly 20 hours and 23 minutes of debt reduction. And let's not forget about the essential matter of cutting back the mortgage interest deduction for yachts as second homes. Again, the President acts as if this is one of the handful of policies that will restore America's prosperity. But if Congress enacted this change, we would cover the 10 years of debt from the Obama budget for all of 15 hours and 47 minutes. Of course, the set of Democratic talking points would not be complete without an attack on the oil companies. The President has talked about making American oil companies pay their fair share by reducing or eliminating domestic energy incentives. This proposal would raise $21 billion in revenue. That would cover a whopping 5 days, 18 hours, and 47 minutes of debt that the President is prepared to take on over the next 10 years. And then there are the rich. Tax the rich. Make them pay their fair share. This class warfare might be appropriate in Europe and countries with a feudal history, but in the United States, a nation conceived in liberty and the proposition that all men are created equal, families and entrepreneurs just don't buy it. And for good reason. Taxing the rich hits job creators and determines the economic growth. But as deficit reduction policy, it falls short as well. In the name of bipartisanship, I'm going to use data from the Tax Policy Center, or TPC, to demonstrate my point. According to TPC models and estimates, for 2011, American households earning more than $1 million account for 12% of the nation's pre-tax income, pay 19% of federal taxes, and carry an average tax rate of 29%. Even more critical from my perspective, these taxpayers also account for 38% of all flow-through income. Flow-through income is predominantly earnings from ownership of small businesses. So raising rates on the rich will hit squarely on those who create and expand the small businesses that need to be the engine for our economic recovery. But let's be clear about something. Higher taxes on these wealthy individuals will not only have adverse economic consequences, it will not even provide the deficit and debt reduction suggested by the left. Even if all the income of those earning more than $1 million a year were confiscated with a 100% rate, with the unlikely assumption of no taxpayer behavioral response, for the year of confiscation, these higher taxes would yield about $893 billion. My gosh, our deficit this year is $1.5 trillion, just in 1 year. The most you'd get is $893 billion, and that's if we're lucky. And this is a one-shot opportunity. If you confiscate this wealth, those individuals would no longer work, save, create more wealth, and generate more tax revenue. And confiscating all the income from those earning over $1 million did not even fix 1 year, not even 1 year, of the 10 years of projected Obama debt. It would cover 244 days, 16 hours, and 34 minutes. All of the demagoguery on jets and yachts and oil companies yields about 1 week of deficit reduction from the President's 10-year debt. Even throwing in a one-time confiscation of all the income for taxpayers above $1 million, you can only add 244 days. Add it all up, and what the President is proposing amounts to less than 1/10 of deficit reduction from the debt President Obama will add over the next 10 years. Last night, the President tossed some more class warfare into the mix. He mentioned taxing hedge fund managers. Now, here's how he put it, quote, "How can we ask a student to pay more for college before we ask hedge fund managers to stop paying taxes at a lower rate than their secretaries," unquote. The proposal he is talking about would tax carried interest as ordinary income. The Joint Tax Committee has provided an estimate on this, and over 10 years, this change in the tax code would generate another $21.4 billion. Now, that's about as much as the oil company tax Obama is proposing of $21.1 billion. This would cover approximately 5 days and 21 hours of the President's 10-year debt. Now, this morning, someone on television was bemoaning the fact that Democrats are not going to the mat for tax increases the way the President has. He suggested that congressional Democrats did not have the courage to support tax increases. With all due respect, the person lacking in courage is the current occupant of the Oval Office. The President had an opportunity this summer. Was he going to lead on the debt crisis, or would it be more of the same? Red herrings piled on top of straw men in an effort to distract the American people from his own complicity in this debt crisis. Yet the President chose not to own up to the American people. The quarterback punted. He offered no solutions. Concerns about re-election were of greater priority than the imminent downgrading of the nation's credit rating, a downgrade that will work as a tax increase on homeowners, students, and the Treasury itself, which is responsible for servicing the $14.3 trillion in existing debt. Unable to propose tax increases on the middle class and unable to reform entitlements due to liberal debt enders, he chose to offer up platitudes and class warfare that might play well with some constituencies but do nothing to address the fundamental problem this nation faces. This country cannot avoid the choices that are coming. We have to get our spending under control. That is why I supported cut, cap, and balance. And that is why I think S.J. Restan, the balanced budget amendment that I introduced along with my colleague and friend from Utah, Senator Lee, and all 47 Senate Republicans, is absolutely essential. It would fix this problem once and for all, but the President opposes it. He talks a lot about empowering people. Well, the founders of this country empowered the American people to make changes to the Constitution. The Constitution provides for that. Why not give them the opportunity to pass this amendment? Remember, if the Democrats don't like it, all they've got to do is get 13 states to disagree. We have to get 38 states to ratify. Why not let the people decide this? Why are they so afraid to let the people decide this? Let me offer an answer, because Democrats are terrified that the American people would ratify it and their big spending practices would go the way of dinosaurs. American people are sick and tired of spending. Mothers and fathers understand that the federal government is going to bankrupt their children and leave them in America that is less free and less prosperous. The American people are frustrated. They might not have the data at their fingertips, but they understood what I just laid out here quite well. We are not going to solve our problems by raising taxes. Increasingly, the President is an island in his call for more tax increases. Republicans don't support him. Independents don't support him. And now even Democrats don't support him. You know, it's time to move on. We need to rein in our debt, and we need to act boldly in doing so. So far, the President has failed to lead on this issue, choosing instead politically convenient talking points. But I would remind my dear friend in the White House that it's never too late to mend this problem. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of the quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Acosta.
President, I ask consent to call the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, what is the parliamentary situation?
The Senate is in a period of morning business in which the senators may speak for 10 minutes.
I thank the distinguished presiding officer. Mr. President, I'll be brief. I've been asked by a number of people how I feel about the efforts made to get the United States out of the quandary it now finds itself in over the debt limit. It was very clear. I applaud President Obama and Majority Leader Reid for real leadership and persistence over many months in trying to find a bipartisan solution to the debt crisis. Senator Reid has put forward a solution that would end the current crisis, reduce our unsustainable national debt. Now, this is a solution that has the potential to draw support from lawmakers from both parties who are willing to put common sense and the national interests above partisanship and ideology. Those who would say, rather than party first, let's go country first, then now we have a framework for a solution. By repeatedly walking away from the table and insisting on their way or no way, those who are holding the American people and our economy hostage are playing ideological games with serious consequences for everyone else. Through their tactics, they threaten great risk to the well-being of ordinary Americans. The longer this goes on, the greater the danger of lasting damage below the waterline of our democracy. Right now, Leader Reid's $2.7 trillion debt reduction package is the best chance, really is the best chance this country has to avoid a default and a credit rating downgrade that would damage our fragile economy. It would also impose a credit hike tax on every American family. We downgrade our credit rating. We are going to be spending hundreds of billions of dollars in interest to other countries, money that they can spend on medical research and on schools and on transportation and alternative energies. They can spend it in their country. We'll be paying the bills, and all because the Congress did not come together on a solution on this issue. Most people looking at this wonder, why haven't we moved? Now, Senator Reid has a plan that can move. It can say that we will spend this money, the money we have, not shipping it overseas to other countries, but spend it on the needs of our own country. The plan consolidates terms agreed to in the ongoing negotiations. It proposes a solution that ends the current crisis. It accomplishes wide-ranging savings. It has enough bipartisan support to pass. It would end the roller coaster of unpredictability that shackles our economy by instead offering financial stability through 2012. Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid beneficiaries be spared a loss of benefits. The American people begin to recognize these savings from withdrawing from Iraq and Afghanistan. And essential education, job creation, housing, and environmental investments for America's economic recovery and for a strong economic future would be protected from the slashing cuts proposed by the House Republicans. The irony is Republican leaders previously have backed all of the spending reductions called for in Leader Reid's plan. Now, I don't agree, and I suspect all of us don't agree with all aspects of this proposed solution. We're not going to have 100 solutions on this floor. We're going to have one that we can vote on. I wish this one included new revenue, especially by ending such costly and outdated tax benefits as those still enjoyed by the biggest oil companies, to help us pay off our debt even more quickly. I'd like to help pay for the debt incurred by the inexcusable earlier decisions to enter 2 wars without paying for them. And I continue to believe the surcharge for the wealthiest would it mean they would pay more of their fair share after so many years of tax cuts that are tilted far more toward the wealthiest of Americans rather than to the middle class. I find it interesting when I hear lectures from those who voted for an unnecessary war in Iraq. Iraq, a country that had nothing whatsoever to do with 9/11, a country that before we invaded had no al-Qaeda, has plenty now, said we will vote for this war, and for the first time in our history, we won't pay for it, we'll just borrow the money. And we'll cut taxes to pay for it, and we'll borrow the money. Look where we are now. We'll eventually owe $3.5 trillion for that war. You know, it's far easier, and I say this to everybody who, like myself, may not see every single thing they want here. It's far easier to walk away from the negotiating table than to make the hard choices needed on behalf of the American people. We need serious statesmanship on both sides for this to work, both sides to get a solution, and both sides to do it before it's too late. The economic health of our country, the jobs of thousands of hard-working Americans should not be mired in politics. It's well past the time, and I realize there's a House faction that is driving much of the decisions there. Well, it's well past time for that faction in the House of Representatives to put politics aside and accept a long-term deficit reduction plan that does not force America's most vulnerable to shoulder the burden. Just as many Vermont families are forced to make difficult financial decisions, Congress has to be open to considering all available options. We do this in my state of Vermont without gimmicks. We don't have any constitutional amendment on balanced budgets or anything like that. We just balance the budget. In that regard, Mr. President, I recall a number who said, let's have a constitutional amendment to balance the budget. No, it'd be years from there. But when we actually had a balanced budget during the Clinton-Gore administration, not a single Republican voted for it. Democrats voted for it. We balanced the budget. We created a surplus, started paying down the national debt, and created 24 million new jobs. Let's go back to those days. Forget the sloganeering. Forget the bumper sticker solutions. If things were that easy, it would have been done long before now. Let's start going back to doing what we're elected to do, what we're paid to do, and also what we are expected to do. Seek a solution, not a gimmick, not a deal, a solution that benefits all Americans. Mr. President, I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Thank you.